Everyone wants to be told that they're sitting on a fortune, that they only have to look in a shoebox and they find thousands of dollars. You see this in all sorts of collectibles. Like, did you know your old Beanie Babies could be worth thousands? But I think in card games specifically, you see a lot of posts, because as far as card games go, like Magic and Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh, there are certain cards out there that people that don't play the game know are worth something, even if they don't understand the difference between additions or rarities or release dates. And what I'm talking about is, I mean, we all know that person. Went to college and you might have talked to someone, you might have told them you play a card game like Yu-Gi-Oh or Pokemon or Magic, and they go, oh yeah, I'm pretty sure I have a Black Lotus in my basement, or I'm pretty sure I have a first edition Charizard in my basement, and that's just not true most of the time. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm sure every once in a while, like once out of every like million people that used to play Magic, they go in their basement and they find a shoebox and there's a Black Lotus sitting there. They just made a couple $1,000s. But in 99% of the cases, people just don't have those cards. And if they do have those cards, maybe not so much in the case of Black Lotus because that one hasn't been reprinted, but in the case of Charizard specifically, and many of the Yu-Gi-Oh cards I'll talk about in today's video, people think they have the expensive version of a card, but they don't realize just how many different Charizards are out there, just how many different Blue Eyes White Dragons are out there, and then they see a clickbait video or a clickbait article that sort of misleads them into believing that, yeah, if you just go look in that shoebox, look in those old cards that you used to collect as a kid, you're sitting on tens of thousands of dollars. All you have to do is go back home and look in that shoebox, and yet you're probably not. So in today's video, if you're someone that plays Yu-Gi-Oh, you can kind of laugh at some of the prices that I'm going to show that I've seen in videos and articles. And if you don't play Yu-Gi-Oh, you may be stumbled upon this because you think your old Yu-Gi-Oh cards are valuable. I'm also going to take the time to explain some ways that you actually can see if you have some valuable cards without doing them in these clickbaity fashions. And these articles that I'm going to look at and these videos that I'm going to look at, they're misleading in a few ways. A lot of times they're misleading in prices, but I think the biggest case that they're misleading is how likely it is for you to have these expensive cards. For example, here's one of the most common videos that I've seen shared over and over again, especially on Facebook. This thing seems to pop up like once a year. The one that I'm watching right here was posted in 2017, which I think is the first year that it was posted, but there's a whole bunch of them from 2018 and 2019. They're already off to a great start. And this thing is basically just entirely false. And I'll sort of describe where they're coming from, because there's a word that they use in this video that I think a lot of people missed. Because what happened when this video first got posted, I don't know which Facebook page it was, but it definitely was a Facebook page. A ton of my friends that knew I played Yu-Gi-Oh tagged me in it or shared it with me and said, oh my gosh, do you know that all these cards are so valuable? Do you have any of these? These cards aren't that valuable, and if you play Yu-Gi-Oh, you'll find this video hilarious, and I showed this on stream the other day. Basically, they do like the standard, like going through these Dark Magician Girl things. Okay, what they're not mentioning here is that you have to have a very, very, very specific version of Dark Magician Girl to even come close to that asking price. But also notice, they're mentioning asking price, not sold price. And that's a big difference, because what these videos in particular are taking from is a one eBay listing that they saw, not necessarily a completed listing. And if you play Yu-Gi-Oh, you'll probably find it pretty laughable when I show this one, which is a common pinch hopper that they're saying the asking price is $5,291. Oh my god, this is wrong on like every single account. First off, Pinch Hopper is not a good card, it's not an iconic card, and it's not a valuable card. This is a common card worth around like $1 at most, maybe a couple more dollars if you get it in near mint version. This is so funny, and how this is preying on like people that don't play Yu-Gi-Oh. They're seeing this and they're thinking, yeah, I don't know how good this card is. I don't play the game. I played it back as a kid. Maybe even they played this card back as a kid and like, oh my god, I remember Pinch Hopper. I should go look at my collection. I landed on $5,000, and they go put their $5,000 Pinch Hopper up on eBay, and no one buys it. No one even like bids on it, and they're like, well, that's weird. Maybe if I cut it down like $4,000, that'll get people like clicking on it, and no one clicks it. And then they look out there and they don't realize that like what they're showing in this video is the asking price of one person, not necessarily a completed listing. And then another hilarious one is the next one. This is Super Ancient Dino Beast, a card that is not good, a card that is not rare, a card that is not hard to find, a card that's been printed hundreds of times in multiple different sort of, I think it's been in like a structure deck, and it was printed in a main set, and it was printed as promo card, all these different printings. And here's what they think the asking price of this version is. $5,289. And if you play this game, if you know even just a little bit about Yu-Gi-Oh, you know this is a ridiculous price, and you wouldn't believe it for a second. But people that don't know anything about Yu-Gi-Oh, and I see this happen time and time again. I mentioned like the Beanie Babies. I think that's like a situation where like people want to hear that they're sitting on all this money when in reality they're not. So people see these videos and they say, oh crap, I'm sitting on thousands of dollars. I better go rummage through my Yu-Gi-Oh collection and see if I have any pinch hoppers, if I have any super ancient Dino Beasts, and maybe they find like a Dark Magician Girl. Maybe they find like the TCG version of Dark Magician Girl that isn't worth $12,000 and never will be worth $12,000 even as like a PSA 10, and they just find it and they don't realize there's so many different factors, and that's kind of what I wanted to talk about in today's video. So that's like one thing that I've seen that was sort of, I saw this and I've seen this a few times, and I just every time I see them, it's like, oh my god, like people are falling for this, and there's nothing they can do about it, because if you're so out of the game that you believe these ridiculous prices on cards like Pinch Hopper, yeah, you're probably not going to understand where they're coming from and how wrong they are. Really misleading for whoever made this video originally. And then you see clickbait titles like this one that say your old Yu-Gi-Oh cards could be worth an absolute fortune, and then like in the first paragraphs here the guy says like, okay, they're probably not worth a fortune and you probably don't have these cards. Just, this is like clickbait at its finest, and it's so crazy to me that like this is even getting posted, just because like the first half starts out with him just like sort of picking on your brain for like nostalgia, but then he like literally says, where does he say it? The first of nearly impossible for the average Joe to own as far as like expensive cards, and then he's going to talk about some cards. And this is where this list, oh my gosh, this list is wrong on two accounts, because the other list gave incorrect prices, but on this list, these first 10 cards, most of these are at least like kind of convincing. But what's happening here is that these are all prize cards, and this is what a lot of these lists do sometimes, is like the two different types of lists. So the lists that mislead you about prices, the lists that tell you prize cards that you almost certainly do not have. So he lists all prize cards here, not really mentioning like rarity. Like, I don't know, it's kind of rough, because like the Minerva like definitely was not. So first off, like there's tons of wrong information in this article, I think that goes without saying, but saying that the super rare Minerva was worth $2,000 isn't true. It's the ultra rare version that's worth that much. Super rare is only worth around like $500 to $700. So there's wrong information just all in this article. It's completely just written by someone that very clearly does not know very much about these cards. The first edition for Blue Eyes does not go for $12,000. We know that, and how do we know that? Because we can look at completed listings instead of just people throwing up any price, and very quickly figure out that Blue Eyes, even as a first edition from LOB, does not go for $12,000. And we know this because when we go to completed listings, things that actually sold, and admittedly there aren't a ton of first edition Blue Eyes cards that are near mint on the market, but the most recent one that was sold was April 10th, and it sold for $3,000, which is a lot, but it's also a quarter of what that person said. And I also want to mention, when I looked this up, I found one, and I feel so bad if they're not watching this video, but I found one that someone bought that was a fake. This is a first edition Blue Eyes White Dragon from LOB001. It sold for $150, and yeah, sorry buddy, this is not a real card. You can just look at it and like instantly know. Like, once again, it's probably someone that didn't really play Yu-Gi-Oh! This card is so obviously fake. You can just tell by looking at the stars, and the rarity's all weird. Oh my gosh, I just saw this and I felt so bad for that guy. But regardless, you know that like the most recently sold one for first edition is $3,000, and I think even that is like a little bit too high. I think what they're taking is these must have been PSA 10s, and they must have been first editions, and I don't know if they were actually sold, but they were ones that were listed. Oftentimes when you sell PSA 10s, it's actually really hard to find a buyer. If the card is super expensive, if it's listed as super expensive, it's very rare to find, especially as like a PSA 10. It doesn't necessarily mean that like you're gonna sell it, which means that the price can kind of float, and it's like, is the card, to me, cards are only worth as much as someone is willing to pay for them. The cards like the prize cards that this person listed, these cards were worth this. They were selling for this price back in the day, or maybe even some of those are a little bit more recent, but usually they're using older prices, where these ones, I'm not so sure if people actually bought them for those crazy outrageous prices. Seems pretty unlikely to anyone that has spent a lot of time collecting Yu-Gi-Oh cards. That in mind, it begs the question, are there actually any older cards that you can find in your shoebox that might be worth something? And there are a lot of things I just wanted to get out of the way, sort of common myths. First off, keep in mind, just because a card is old doesn't mean it's expensive. Oftentimes when people say to me like, oh, I have all these old cards, they must be worth something, right? They're really not worth anything unless they're like holographic, unless they're in good condition, and also unless they're like the right card, the right edition, all these different tiny factors that can make a huge difference. So when people send me pictures of stuff or ask me to look at pictures of older cards, usually it's not worth, unless you have like a lot of spare time, it's not worth looking up any of the common cards, those are the non-holographic cards, any of the rare cards, which are just have the silver lettering. Really, you just want to start at super rares, which is holographic pictures, or anything with holographic pictures is at least worth looking up. But realistically, you're not going to find anything worth anything. And I think another issue, a common myth, is that if a card says limited edition, suddenly it's expensive, and that is so far from the truth. And I don't know if it's just because I play a lot of card games and I have research into other collectible hobbies, but usually as far as hobbies go, when something says limited edition, especially in the case of card games, it doesn't mean it's expensive, because if the card literally says it's limited edition, every single person's going to say, oh, I better stock up on those because they're limited edition, and now there's a surplus of those in the market. The true cards that are expensive are things like the original first edition Blue Eyes. They're not outrageously expensive. They're not like $12,000, but they are more expensive than other cards, because when the first set came out, people didn't know that the game was going to blow up. So people weren't told this is a limited edition release, you gotta get your hands on this. They didn't realize that. That's why those cards are so expensive, because they weren't hoarded by people trying to invest for the future. They're just normal cards. That's why those first edition Blue Eyes are worth more than the average card out there. But no, plenty of limited edition cards. Actually, most of the old limited edition cards aren't worth anything, specifically because yes, there's a surplus of them. Also, a lot of them just tend to be really, really bad outside of a few sort of smaller cases. But that's not to say that every single old card that you might have is worthless. And I would say that in some cases, there are cards out there that you might have actually had that might be worth something even in damaged condition. This is one case where I will say, with full disclosure here, if you have this card, this very specific card from this specific release, even if it's damaged, even if you kept it with rubber bands, it is probably still worth something. I've seen the most damaged versions of these cards even go for like $100. It's actually kind of crazy. So the Dark Dual Stories game for Game Boy Color, there were promos releasing this, Exodia, Dark Edition, and Blue Eyes, and the Blue Eyes in particular is worth a lot of money even if it's damaged. There are tons of completed listings, and you have to be really careful when you're looking at these, because a lot of times these completed listings are on proxy versions. You might see lower prices, but when you look at like this one, it said heavy play and it was sold for $300. It's sold by Jobber, a very well-known YouTuber as well. Shout out to Jobber. But overall, this DDS version of Blue Eyes, and I mean, it has to say DDS on it. Like, it'll literally say on the card. I can bring it up here, hopefully. It'll say right there, DDS001. This is the very, very specific version of Blue Eyes White Dragon. Just because it has this artwork, just because it's a secret rare, it doesn't really matter. It has to say DDS on it right there in the corner. This is a card that even if you have it damaged, it'll still be worth quite a bit of money. Once again, very, very unlikely, especially if you didn't have a Game Boy Color. Like me, I didn't even have a Game Boy Color. That was a little bit before my time. So very unlikely for you to have this. But this is a card that I think out of all the crazy cards out there that you could find that'd be worth real money, the DDS Blue Eyes is probably the most likely of all the other unlikely choices. Yes, we all want to find money that we didn't know existed just sitting in a shoebox. I know I've said that phrase probably too much for this one video, but overall, just don't pester your card game friends with all of your like common cards. If you think you have something worth selling, worth other people actually purchasing, just look it up yourself. Take the time to look at the holographic cards, look on eBay, look on TCG Player, see what people are selling them for. Try to pay careful attention to all the different aspects of the cards, the edition, the condition, the rarities. All those things are super important. If you narrow it down to like a couple cards, maybe send your friend that knows TCGs, like maybe you can send him that picture, but don't send him a picture of like 100 common cards. Even if you go on like Facebook Marketplace, which maybe I should have done for this video, I didn't want to like roast anyone, but there are so many sales going on Facebook Marketplace that are just garbage, like literal just common cards that are super like ripped up, heavy played, that people are selling for like $1 a card, when in reality they're probably worth like 10 cents at most. At the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is that if Pinch Hopper was actually worth thousands of dollars, every single Yu-Gi-Oh player would probably be a millionaire. Anyway though, hope you guys enjoyed today's discussion video on all these crazy old school Yu-Gi-Oh card prices. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.